Bé, doncs això és un congrés, doncs comencem el congrés. Comencem amb una conferència inaugural d'una professora d'investigació en públics en audiències de la Universitat Deakin d'Austràlia. Ella és una de les 4 editores, jo diria que de la Bíblia ara mateix, del desenvolupament de públics en les arts escèniques, la Routledge Companion to Audiences and the Performing Arts, és a dir, la gran compilació dels públics en les arts escèniques, que va ser publicada justament aquest abril. Són 600 pàgines plenes de visions, de revisions transversals i absolutament polièdriques sobre les espectadores i els espectadors de teatre. Té una introducció, aquest llibre, aquestes 600 pàgines, que porta per títol La paradoxa dels públics, i justament serà el títol d'aquesta conferència inaugural. La conferenciant ens parlarà de l'acte extraordinari que suposa ser espectadores i espectadors i de les maneres en què podem canviar els nostres patrons de pensament per entendre millor el poder que exerceixen els públics. Amb tots vosaltres, Katya Johanson.
Bon dia and buenos dias. I can't tell you how wonderful it is to be in Barcelona. I think for many of us, just a few months ago, we wouldn't have thought this was possible. And even up until the time that my flight left, I was thinking, I'm sure something is going to go wrong. So it's really wonderful to be here. In Australia, it's customary to explain who the traditional owners of the land that you come from are when you're giving any kind of formal introduction. So I'll just explain that I'm from the Wurundjeri country, the country of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, in what's now known as Melbourne in Victoria in Australia. And so in our effort to better understand the significance of audiences and their relationship to one another and to performances, I'm going to talk to you today about not 1 but 5 paradoxes in the way that we think about audiences. I've been interested in audiences for a very long time, and I've had the very good fortune to work with a range of other people. And I think that together, we've really managed to kind of bring together a discipline around audience research that steps outside the usual interest in screen audiences to look at audiences for the live performing arts as well. So much of the discussion that I'm going to go into today relates to the work of other people, this group that I've been working with, and I'll include a list of them at the end. However, there are 3 people that do require mention right at the outset. As Pepe explained, I was part of a group of 4 editors that brought together the Routledge Companion to Audiences in the Performing Arts earlier this year. And the work that I'm going to talk to you about today is really the work of all 4 editors. So my great gratitude to Matthew Reason, Lynn Connor and Ben Walmsley. They're very much part of this research. And the reason that we brought the Routledge Companion together was because we felt that we could see across the research on audiences that it takes place in different disciplines and with a great deal of different methodologies, and we wanted to bring it all together in relation to one another to help us build a kind of a collective understanding of the complexity of what audiences are and what it means to be in the audience. So as we came to write the introduction, we could see that the vastly different work on audiences from different disciplines means that both the act of being in the audience and this collective thing that we call the audience is characterized by very different beliefs that coexist. And so that's what I wanted to talk to you about today. But before I go on to talk about the paradoxes and why they're important to knowledge, I'll just tell you a little bit about myself and my interest in audience research. I grew up in Adelaide, which is the red dot there at the very bottom of Australia. And when I was growing up, it was quite an isolated city of about 1 million people, about 800 kilometres from the next major city, which is Melbourne down there on your right. And when I was growing up, I really had the very strong sense that this was not a city that welcomed creativity or eccentricity or diversity very much. But over the period of my youth, as I was growing up, it became known as the festival city. And like many of you, I'm sure, I sort of found myself very much drawn to the kind of eclectic range of people that tend to congregate around the performing arts. And I never really saw myself as a performer in this, but nonetheless, I just thought, this is me going off to my first performance, one of only a very few when I was 5 years old. So why is thinking about audiences through this framework of paradoxes valuable? Excuse me. Theatre and the performing arts generally, in the theatre and in the performing arts more generally, we often find ourselves to be blindsided by change. And the current climate is a very good example of that, I'm sure, in all of our countries. In Australia, at the moment, most theatre companies are really reeling from the impact of COVID-19, and the impact has been felt much more, since, in a sense, the end of the lockdowns around the pandemic, because we find now that ticket sales just are not recovering to their 2019 levels. And instead, people are choosing to book much later and much more spontaneously than they have in the past. And so I think one of the things that what we do when we think about paradoxes is that we avoid making assumptions, and we recognise that we need to keep contradictory but equally valid facts in our heads. So people, for instance, can want to come to the theatre but not want to book in advance, for instance. Paradoxes, they provide an important way to highlight conflicts between the beliefs that we hold most dear. This is an author, Margaret Kwanzo, who is a philosopher on paradoxes. And she said, by bringing to light conflicts around our firmly held beliefs, paradoxes demand answers from us. In our pursuit of paradoxes and solutions, we are committing ourselves to lives that are more thoughtful and more guided by reason. And it's really that kind of framework that we wanted to bring to our thinking around audiences. So where there's a kind of a slippage between what appear to be perfectly reasonable beliefs on the one hand, there is need to investigate. And so we argue that the paradoxes around audiences have led us to misunderstand and to underestimate and ignore their contribution to theatre performance. So this is really the principle that underlines my presentation. But first of all, what is a paradox? In what sense are we using this term? At the least, the notion of a paradox has three meanings. First of all, and again I'm quoting from Margaret Kwanzo here, the first one is that a paradox is a set of mutually inconsistent propositions, each of which seems to be true. Secondly, there's the idea that a paradox is an argument that has apparently a valid reasoning and true premises, but an obviously false conclusion. So the conclusion you draw from these true premises is false. And thirdly, turning that on its head, a paradox is an unacceptable conclusion that's drawn from seemingly true premises and correct reasoning. And so the 5 paradoxes that I'm going to talk about today all fall into one of those categories. So we've given these paradoxes names. The first one is the ordinary extraordinary paradox. The second one is the passivity paradox, the attention paradox, the collectivity paradox, and then the knowledge paradox. So I'll start by talking about the ordinary extraordinary paradox. The first proposition here is that being an audience is a very everyday, ordinary activity. Many years ago, Irving Goffman argued that we perform every day as part of our everyday daily lives. And Raymond Williams argued that culture, more generally, should be part of our ordinary, everyday lives. And this is a view that's now seen something of a renaissance. In Britain, in the town of Kirklees, in West Yorkshire, right at this minute, Kirklees is calling for contributions to its draft arts and culture strategy with the tagline that culture is ordinary. And I'll just quote from the workshop that the creative development team in Kirklees is going to run in November. We want culture to be exciting, experimental and celebratory, but also deemed ordinary because it's part of everyone's lives. By ordinary, we mean inclusive and accessible to everyone, made by young people, created by older people, cherished and embraced in communities. But it's also useful to see the ordinariness of our experience as audiences as a continuum from those things that we do that aren't explicitly seen as cultural. We're an audience every day, in the most ordinary of ways. You're an audience for me here at the moment, and although arguably this Congress is quite exceptional, it's not ordinary, you're probably quite used to sitting in a theatre listening to a lecture. So this is an earlier version of an audience I had for a similar occasion in Melbourne, for instance. But even more ordinarily, I'm an audience to fellow patients in a medical clinic, and I'm an audience to my students when they're giving me a talk in a tutorial. I'm an audience to passengers on the train. Listening and watching are at least 50% of what we do in our daily lives. But this isn't to underplay its significance at all. In fact, being an audience in this ordinary way is extremely important to keeping us alive and keeping us ourselves and everyone around us alive. Being an audience shows that we're watching out for people. So daily communication, that act of both being and having an audience, is key to the everyday functioning of the human body. We could say that loneliness is the state of not having an audience. Loneliness is the state of not being heard, not being understood or contradicted, and not believing that our senses are in sympathy with others, or that anything that we might wish to say or demonstrate has a value to others. And loneliness, as we now know, is a contributor to many life-threatening illnesses, including things like depression, dementia, cardiovascular disease, and stroke. So it's for this reason that there's a growing move for doctors to prescribe arts participation in response to our mental health malaise. So in this sense as well, we're helping to keep each other alive by being an audience for each other. And as well as being related to our mortality, the act of being an audience is essential to our physical, neurological, and psychological development. One of the very first pieces of theatre we see is our siblings or our cousins at play. As they clown around the living room, making our baby selves laugh, we learn to walk, we learn to jump, and we learn to tumble from their antics. We learn to speak and to sing from our parents and grandparents, who soothe us to sleep at night with a song, or they cajole us into doing those chores that we need to do. We're an audience to our teachers' storytelling at school, because stories drive home lessons far better than any other way of teaching. So just as breathing, eating, and exercising are essential for our good health, but are so ordinary that we don't mention them, so too is both having and being in an audience. And in fact, the ethologist and cultural anthropologist Ellen Dissanayake suggests that there's a critical relationship between an infant and a caregiver that's the origin of the exchange between the audience and the performer. She begins her argument with the psychiatrist Daniel Stern's 1977 proposition that the relationship between a mother and a baby is that of a performance or a dance, in which the two parties respond to each other as though they're on the same wavelength. But Dissanayake takes that a bit further. She draws on evolutionary theory to develop this connection between child rearing and performance. As humans evolved to do more and more complex activity and their brains got bigger and bigger, these large-headed human infants were born earlier and at a less mature stage than those of other primates. And so this lack of a newborn baby's maturity means that the bond between the mother and child became more important to the child's survival and gave rise to familial and then human intimacy. So we take this for granted now, this idea in evolutionary theory, but what's interesting is the role that performance played in this intimacy. In this video here, you can't see the mother, but you can hear her.
What's he doing? Really? Tell me more. That's right. That's right. Tell me. Yeah. Tell me how you punched those little owls hanging over your crib. Yes, you did. Get them. Tell me how you get them.
So you know exactly what's going on in this performance, and I'm sure many of you have done it yourselves to newborn babies. And you can see the baby encouraging the mother and the mother encouraging the baby. So this is obviously a very participatory act between the two players. And so this communicative behaviour we call proto-aesthetics. The mother doesn't consciously think of her actions as performative, and initially the baby doesn't think that its behaviour is encouraging. Instead, they do this dance together because it helps to achieve the end that they're both instinctively looking for, that is, survival for the baby and reproduction for the mother. And then gradually the baby starts to look outward for its performances. And then it starts to take on a greater role as the performer itself. But it's this instinct that makes us, every one of us, not just predisposed to create a performance like the mother is doing, but also to respond to a performance like the baby. So in other words, spectating is inherent to our self of sense and other in a way that begins in infancy. But perhaps because we're trained from it from our very first breath, and we take it for granted, the act of being in the audience is not just ordinary, but it's remarkably invisible. So long after we leave that family nest and we go off into the theatres and the galleries and the exhibitions and the festivals, our act of being an audience remains invisible. Audiences don't appear in a roll of credits after a film. They don't appear in a theatre program. While great theatre and great actors and great scripts are all remembered, audiences aren't. They're very rarely even mentioned in the practice of reviewing, usually only if they misbehave. So while the act of the audience is critical to making us function well, both individually and collectively, as a role, it's so ordinary and so everyday that it's overlooked. So I hope I've persuaded you here that being an audience is very ordinary. Yet the paradoxical thing here is that being an audience also marks out the extraordinary periods in our own lives. Traditionally, our weddings were held in front of an audience because it's the presence of the audience that makes that marriage seem real. Our funerals too and our christenings all take place in front of an audience, and it's there that the deaths and births become real to the community around the family. And we tend to only get married a handful of times, and we generally only get one funeral and have had one christening. So these are quite extraordinary events in our lives. But it's the audience that makes real those very dramatic changes in our lives, the marriages, the deaths and the births. And being an audience is also crucial to those regular events that happen to us in our collective lives that have extraordinary consequences. So a jury, for instance, is an audience. An electorate during a political campaign is also an audience, and their attention as an audience is key to ensuring that justice is done and that the leaders elected are appropriate to the pressing needs of our time. And of course, there is a great deal of ritual and theatre about the events that juries and voters are asked to watch. And what's been made starkly evident lately is that the traditional assumptions that we've had about how the performer and audience communicate in the political system are no longer reliable. So I've come to you from Australia, and earlier this year in Australia we had a federal election that resulted in the election of a Labor government, so a left-wing government, and the overthrow of a long-standing Conservative government. That's not exceptional. Australia has a two-party system. It tends to alternate between one and the other. But what was really exceptional about this election was what we've come to call the green slide. In this election, independent candidates and Greens candidates picked up an unprecedented number of votes. And this was considered to be quite an extraordinary outcome for this country that's always been characterised by a two-party system. So I know you're thinking, well, of course, climate change is becoming ever more evident. Of course, a party like the Greens that makes environmental concerns its chief part of its platform will pick up more votes as time goes on. But this also really reflected the craft behind what the Greens and the Independents did in their campaign behaviour. They took up a traditional but also quite an abandoned practice of knocking on voters' doors. And unlike the major parties, these small players, they don't knock on your doors to give you a lecture about what their policy priorities are and why that you should vote for them. Instead, they knock on your door to ask you what you want from politics. They invite you, the voter, to lecture them about your concerns, about your neighbourhood, about your children's lives, about your hopes for the future, the state of your neighbourhood, whatever it might be. And they promise to take these messages on board in shaping policy. So in other words, they offer themselves up to you as an audience, you the voter as an audience. And they now know that this has been critical to their success. So next month in my state of Victoria, there'll be a state election, and the Greens are behaving in the same way, of course, as they did federally. But in a greater sense as well, we're an audience to those once-in-a-lifetime events that are unexpected and shocking. So where were you when Princess Diana died? Where were you when Capitol Hill was invaded? Where were you when the planes flew into the Twin Towers? People will ask each other these questions. Where were you? What were you doing when? And what they're doing is inviting you to place yourself in the audience for these extraordinary events. By asking where were you, we are invited to situate ourselves in their reception. We're invited to implicate ourselves into these events by making a story of our own experience of being in the audience. So how does it help to our thinking about theatre audiences to think through this paradox that audiences are both ordinary and extraordinary? I think it helps to say that we're all instinctively an audience, that this is something that's been built into us from birth. And it also helps to acknowledge that if our everyday lives are performative, then we also need to be playing the role of an audience. And finally, I think we need to recognise that while being an audience is an everyday, ordinary event, it also marks the extraordinary occasions in people's lives, so that we treat every opportunity when we have an audience to have the potential for something extraordinary to take place in their lives, and to recognise that it may be extraordinary for them. So that's my first paradox. The second one is the passivity paradox. And this is one that you might now be much more attuned to. This is the idea that audiences are little more than a passive consumer. The historian Susan Bennett took apart the Western history of what it's meant to be in the audience, beginning with ancient Greece and working up to when there was no sort of physical barrier, if you like, between the performer and the audience, and working up to her own time of writing in 1990. And she talked about there being a slow and inexorable decline in active interaction by audiences. The last straw was the introduction of the footlights that present a hard physical barrier between the stage and the audience. So, lighting to dim the audience and to accentuate the stage, that sort of steeped seating, a proscenium arch, an orchestra pit, all of these things, they're strategies to allow for the best spectating and the best sound experience possible. But they're also designed in a way to incapacitate the audience and to prevent them from the temptation of becoming too involved. So while in traditional collectivist societies we might have made art together, while in traditional collectivist societies we might have made art together, over the past 3 or 4 centuries, we've found ourselves doing less and less collective art making, and as we've become more industrialised and now, of course, more globalised. So as professional theatre companies and dance companies have mushroomed, so that we can now outsource and pay for our art making in the same way that we outsource and pay for childcare, housekeeping and home repairs. What that means is that active interaction between audiences and performers has become replaced by silence, stillness and political stasis. The reduction of active participation in creative activity and its replacement with this role of an observer, we might think of that as being a great collective shame, and indeed Ellen Disaniaki describes it as being like having a vitamin deficiency and not knowing it. So that then when you take your vitamin D or vitamin B12 or whatever it is, you see the difference in the way that you felt before you started taking them. So most people won't die from a lack of arts participation, but they are certainly primed to have it. And this separation of the performers from the audience, with the consequent expectation that audiences sit quietly and just watch, is a criticism that's often levelled at Western-style performances from performance practitioners from Asian and African traditions. Researchers from these other traditions use examples of the expectation of engagement by the audience on occasions such as like Indian dance performances, where the expectation is that audiences will join in vocalising, singing along to songs or engaging in dialogues with performers, but that even when they're silent, they're giving their energy and their presence. Researchers from Asian cultures suggest that the idea of a passive gaze is actually just a red herring from the West. Instead of questioning whether audiences are or should be active or passive, they prefer to ask about the appropriate mode of audience participation. So, you might now say that this view is outdated, that the rise of participatory theatre and the influence of Eastern traditions and things like the integration of interactive media technologies throughout the 2000s means that there are very few passive audiences anymore. And it is true that in recent years we're busily undoing those protocols that separate the audience and the performer. So here's a quote from Caroline Heim, who's a fellow audience researcher. "These early decades of the 21st century are exhilarating times for audiences. the role of audiences and their behaviour in plays and musicals on Broadway and the West End has changed dramatically in the last decade or so. Audience members often scream, they hold hands, go up on stage, take photos with their iPads, talk back to the stage, write their own reviews, and customarily give standing ovations after every performance. Indeed, audience expectations of participation can challenge the determination of even the most willing theatre practitioners. And I'm just going to give you an example of this from my own experience. In 2021, I was working with a research team in Melbourne and with the Malthouse Theatre. Just as a bit of background, you may know that in the period that we've gone through together, 2020 to 2021, Melbourne experienced the longest number, I believe it was the longest number of days in total lockdown of any city in the world at 226 days. And I'm not looking for sympathy, I know that things were very difficult in here in Barcelona as well, and indeed around the world. But at the time that I was working with the Malthouse Theatre, it had unexpectedly just received a bit of a creative coup as a result of these lockdowns. Like all theatres, it had to cancel its annual program, but it still received its annual budget. So it chose to invest that budget in just one production that it was able to bring out briefly between lockdowns. So Melbourne had this, very strict rule, even between the lockdowns, that only 60 people could be in the building, and the building accommodated several thousand on a good night. So the production that the Malthouse invested in was called Because the Night, and it's an adaptation of Shakespeare's Hamlet, in which the theatre turned its three theatres into 8 or 9 very elaborately designed rooms of what was a pretty grungy and down at heel Elsinore Castle. And putting the set together really gave back of house staff a much needed purpose while they were all locked down during COVID, as they got to research and build these extraordinary sets, and they went about sort of plundering Facebook Marketplace to choose the best things to put up in the spaces. When the play was performed between Melbourne's lockdowns, audiences were able to roam from one room to another looking for clues, and the actors stood amongst them performing. So I'm just going to show you the video trailer for this production, and you'll see that there's a woman who's wearing a brown leather jacket, and in this trailer she's playing the part of an audience member. So if we could show the video.
Don't go anywhere. Come straight here. Don't talk to anyone else. Do you hear me?
I never realized how difficult it was.
Living or killing?
Look, Dad, the timber workers, they want a better future. To own the land they work on, to stop dying in the mills.
Polonius? I killed him, Mum. It was an accident.
Ma'am, you need to cancel tonight's fireworks.
What?
The crosscutters are planning another attack.
More fireworks? I hope you're not aiding some terrorist plot with these celebratory explosives. Although they need more than this to blow the place away.
Beware the schoolmistress. The history of Elsinore she teaches.
So that's the audience.
The stories of the forest she tells are fraught. They are not fact.
Do you know who murdered him? His own sister. Your lover.
The sacrifice to the forest. Lead a ball, feed the trees, to protect the lives of the Elsinore timber workers.
Hamlet, these Union terrorists are destroying everything your father built.
It never crossed your mind that it could be her? And then took the throne for herself?
Hamlet, you need to be careful what you say in the open.
I don't care. People need to know.
Elsinore needs me. It needs me. I can fix this place. You know I can.
And may the hunger of the trees be as satisfied as our own.
Okay, so the voiceover at the beginning of the performance, when it was staged, lay out all of the COVID-19 regulations and asked the audience members not to touch the performers. And then initially it asked them to be detectives in solving this puzzle of who kills the king. But the problem was that the audience took this responsibility very seriously. On the first night, they set about ripping the set to pieces. They pulled down shelves and posters and even took the fire extinguishers, which were not part of the performance, off the walls. The staff of the theatre were quite shocked by this, and the next morning they had to kind of regroup to work out what to do about it. And they felt, that their edict to the audience to think of themselves as detectives actually sent the wrong messages. And so from then on, from the next performance onwards, they started to ask audiences to act as silent witnesses or ghosts instead. And you can see by the way that the audience member is performing in that trailer that she's very much modelling the kind of the expectation of behaviour from audiences. So you can see here that there's not so much a distinction between active and passive audiences, but rather sort of appropriate and inappropriate audience behaviour. So examples like the Malthouse show the risks and considerations that theatre companies need to give when they invite audiences to be involved in a performance. And perhaps because of this, and despite examples like this, we still generally think of the action as being provided on the stage, and that audiences are there to take it all in. Moreover, placing somebody in the position of an audience also does have the effect of pacifying them. So this is a common example, and again, I'm sure that there are many of us in the audience who have done this same behaviour in order to pacify, for instance, a child in our care at moments that we need that time to ourselves. But you might also think about the fact that we have television screens on the back of every plane seat, screens in a hospital waiting room and on train platforms, for example. So certainly this expectation of passivity continues to trouble the people who tend not to attend theatre performances. So I do a lot of research with both people who choose to be in audiences for the theatre and people who choose not to be. And here's quite a typical comment from a focus group participant who told us that they preferred not to attend a theatre performance. So this participant said, in stand-up comedy and live music, which he was much more familiar with, there's lots of interaction, and the performer is really trying to get audience participation and feedback. But in theatre, I think it's more like art on a wall, in that it's about how the audience perceives it without having much interaction. You can't get information from the performer as to whether he wants you to laugh or be silent, and I find that quite difficult. However, even when the nature and structure of a production assumes the physical passivity from the audience is still instrumental to that production. And theatre makers are increasingly attuned to this, attuned to the audience, including the qualities of their silence. So here is a quote from theatre director Peter Brook. When one reaches the eventual audience, the great barometer is actually in their levels of silence. If one listens carefully, you can learn something about a performance from the degree of silence it creates. Sometimes an emotion ripples through the audience and the quality of the silence is transformed. And meanwhile, during COVID-19 crowd restrictions, we learnt about the wrong kind of silence. This was most clearly articulated in my experience in sport, but it was certainly something that we felt in terms of the performing arts as well when they were live streamed or digitalised. Watching on our television sets at home and listening to the sounds of, say, football players on the field, we felt that we were watching amateur matches because we couldn't hear the sound of the audience around them. We didn't know, it took us a little while to kind of catch up with what was happening. And the players, too, lacked that sort of home advantage that comes from being egged on by a live audience. And so what they found was that scores dropped. So what paradoxes do is they signal a kind of a trouble with our reasoning. When we assume that audiences are passive, the trouble with our reasoning lies in the way that we take the audience's rapt attention as symptomatic of passive consumption, concluding that they're simply drinking in the product that has been provided for them. We need instead to start thinking of quality as the criterion of the experience as well as of the product. So I just returned to the idea that Ellen Dissanayake adapted from Daniel Stern's analogy of that parent-child relationship as a dance. Audiences contribute to a performance through their attention, just as a baby does for its parent. Their encouragement, whether it's silent or performed, is all part of the dance. So it's not that theatre has the power to move us forward as society, but that it's this collective, reciprocal and often alternating dance between the theatre and the audience that does it. We know that what audiences do in a performance is to make an active contribution, so we should call it work in the same way that we now describe the role of play in children's lives as being their work. And now to our third paradox, which is the collectivity paradox. This is the fact that being in the audience is both a profoundly collective and a profoundly individual experience. From an external perspective, we readily think of the audience as being a collective. We call it the audience. You are the audience. Yet we all know that there's no such thing as one singular audience monolith. And one risk of seeing the audience as a single monolith is that we tend to overlook the issue of who is and who isn't present in the audience. We tend to assume that theatre appeals to all people because we see them en masse. And when we're presented with information to the contrary, we tend to think that the problem lies with the people who don't attend, that they lack taste or that they don't understand what we're doing, rather than the theatre production itself or the institution of theatre. We also tend to assume that the people who are in the audience are there because of the quality of the work we've produced, which is often not true, as I'll go on to describe. So in the meantime, there's no such thing as the audience monolith, but the truth is that the audience is still often a collective. At a personal level, we often seek out the experience of being in an audience because we want to be part of that collective, and we use our experience as an audience member to achieve that. So again, here's an example from a focus group member, who is one who does enjoy being in the audience. They said, "What I love about audiences for the theatre is that collective surge that can sometimes happen. It's not always palpable, but this sense of everybody moving forward, or relief, or maybe it's just uncomfortable of feeling the person next to you reacting." And so again, I'm going to go back to Saniaki's work here. She argues that people feel close to those with whom they do things. In contemporary society, people in the audience are unlikely to know each other, but sitting or standing alongside each other, sharing a hopefully positive experience, gives us all a sense of belonging. And so what is it about performing arts that lend themselves to this collective experience? I think this is more than just our instinct to be part of a group. I think there's a relationship between being in a collective and being able to vicariously experience social issues and political issues, and that it's actually this second experience that we're all looking for in theatre. As humans, we're very practiced at taking our experiences and turning them into memories that shape our future responses. And theatre helps us to do this by providing experiences that are purely vicarious and which we can form into memories to shape our responses should those actual experiences or ones that resemble them arise. And it's for this reason that significant social and political issues play out in our stages and screens long before and long after they play out in the news. So during COVID-19, for instance, the people who did venture out onto our streets in our major cities, New York, Berlin, Barcelona, Sydney, would say to each other, it's like being in a dystopian film, like Dawn of the Planet of the Apes, for instance. And there have been many times when I myself, when running from the train, have got to the train station, I'm sure, by imagining myself to be Lola in Run, Lola, Run. Or more recently, because I can no longer see myself as being in a relationship with a drug courier, Julie in Full Time, for instance. So the themes we see on stages and screens allow audiences to place themselves in the situations of their fellow human beings, now, historically, or into the future, to ask themselves, how would I or how will I behave in that situation? So by sitting or standing in the audience, we don't just observe those events and emotions playing out on our stages, but we experience them ourselves. We've got the opportunity to live them over and over again for as many perspectives as our appetite allows. We work to make ourselves mentally and physically and emotionally ready for those experiences. And without necessarily recognising it, we use our time as a theatre audience to practice and to review our reactions, to nurture our hurts and our hopes, and reflect on and judge, let's face it, the behaviour of others. We form a collective both within the theatre and then outside it, across history. So, audiences are collective, and yet they're also individual. Performances are not just a collective experiences, they're also a space for individual reflection. So we might suggest to our friends that we spend Friday night at the theatre, specifically so we don't have to talk to those friends. Instead, we use the kind of comfort of sitting alongside each other in perfect silence, each of us lost in a singular relationship with the performance, but enjoying each other's company. And how well we experience this singular relationship is influenced by the fact that the audience experience is also significantly based on our own individual life experiences, our own capacities, and even, or particularly, really, our own day. So we bring into the theatre that sort of incredibly heavy weight of our individual culture. That sort of unique combination of our upbringing, our class, our race, our ethnicity, our gender, our ability, our education, or our sexual preferences, each of us brings that combination in with us in what turns out to be a very burdensome and irremovable backpack. And that really uniquely influences what we choose for a performance and for what reasons and what we experience when we're there. We also bring into the performance our hopes and our expectations of that performance. So, for instance, you might walk in thinking, how wonderful that I have this opportunity to lose myself in a powerful score, while I walk in thinking, I really don't enjoy opera, but I do know that my partner loves it, and I just hope that it doesn't go on for too long and I have a chance to ring my sister afterwards. Or perhaps I think, I doubt that I'll like this, but hopefully the fact that I'm here will impress my colleagues. And we also bring into the theatre the accumulation of our day. So I will walk in with a lingering whiff of jet lag and with some resentment that I've nurtured out there in the lobby on my way in, while you walk in very contentedly because you've just had a long dinner with old friends and a glass of cava, so you're very happy. So with this great list of factors that influence the way that we choose to and respond to a performance, we audience members have the capacity to both reach out and to annoy each other. As much as performers might like to feel that they have our full attention, we're also very attuned to the people that sit alongside us. I can see that you are, even while we can't see them front on. So here's a quote from another audience member. This one isn't mine. I didn't record this one. But they say, when one's concentration goes, the body needs a release. So by crossing one's legs, sitting up on one's chair, and coughing, of course, that is the cacophony of failure. One senses the dispersion. People who start moving, changing position, they're leaning like this on their hand, or they dip their head and they look at others, and you feel they're thinking, shit, this is never going to end. They look at their watch, and so it does show, I've got antennae. So these observations really underline the limitations of treating the audience as a single generic entity and the importance of shifting patterns of interaction and influence within the audience. So we want to both experience an audience as a collectivity, but we also don't want it to be reduced to that singular mass experience. A desire for collectivity, which is sort of very much felt emotionally within an auditorium, is countered by our awareness of the dangers of subsuming the self into the other. And the paradox is that while we at once desire the collective experience, we also recognise the need to assert difference, diversity, and individual experience. We seek social noise and we seek silent contemplation, and theatre's need to allow us to do both. The fourth paradox is the attention paradox, and this lies between the emphasis on sight and sound on one hand and the reality of the way that many of us feel the experience of being in a theatre. So the word theatre derives from theatron in ancient Greek, which means a place for viewing. Audiences refers to the ears, of course, and spectators to the eyes. So our ideas about theatre audiences are very much oriented around these distal senses, as they're called, the visual and oral senses. And recently, researchers have drawn attention to a kind of a sense hierarchy. The thinking here is that because sight and sound are regarded as the pathways to absorbing formal and structured, kind of complex public objects or happenings, we can only experience aesthetics through our visual and oral senses. In contrast, this hierarchy suggests that touch and smell give us access to only those private and rudimentary pleasures of mere internal sensation. So again, we have this binary created with a sense of high and low value on either side of the binary. And, there's perhaps a logic to prioritising sound and sight in the theatre, in that theatre is principally a storytelling platform, right? And the key methods of stories are things like narrative arcs, plot, suspense, and characterisation. And these all have a complexity that's difficult, if not impossible, to convey by the other senses, the smell and the the smell and the touch and the taste. However, our mistake is to assume that these senses can be neatly kind of cleaved away from each other in the aesthetic experience. Instead, they actually act in concert to provide a whole sensory experience. So consider the example of book reading, for example. So this is equally, if not more, you would say, more than theatre, a storytelling activity. Most of us assume that reading is entirely sight dependent because it relies on the processing of text with our eyesight. And yet when we conducted research with teenage readers earlier this year, we asked them specifically about their reading for enjoyment and what they sought from the reading experience. And many of them commented that they enjoyed the actual tactility of holding a physical book in their hands and the smell of the paper. I think this is becoming more and more the case as education moves more and more to digital formats. It's a relief from the education that they spent most of their day doing. So there are two problems associated with this binary around the senses. Firstly, it's arguably reductive in that it's not necessarily true that touch, smell and taste are incapable of communicating complexity. Clearly a sommelier or a conscientious chef would argue for the power of taste in this respect. And an object's functional beauty is equally apparent through touch. The pen I hold feels nice, so therefore it's a beautiful pen, for instance. And scent is sometimes used to engage a theatre audience, such as by using the smell of an apple pie baking in an oven off stage to provide the audience with a very real sense that they're actually sitting inside an American diner. I have my own story about smell and performance, although I think it's probably not the kind of smell that researchers mean. And I'll just begin this story by going back to my experience growing up as a child in Adelaide. I lived next door to a home butchery where cattle and sheep were slaughtered. Okay, hold that thought. Now move ahead into 2017. I've seen quite a bit of circus in my time, but in Australia we have very strict regulations about the treatment of animals, which means that circus changed long ago so that we no longer see performing monkeys or seals, but rather humans who can do extraordinary things with their bodies. So as a result, theatre looks much more like this, and it looks much less like this. In fact, it doesn't look at all like this. But in 2017, I was invited to China on a professional trip and invited to attend a circus with my hosts. I'm somebody who likes to squeamishly avoid the mistreatment of animals, so I asked if there were going to be any animals involved in the performance. And of course, the subtext to that question is, are any animals harmed in the making of this production? I was reassured that there wouldn't be any animals, but I don't know, and I don't know if that was an interpretation confusion or if it was my hosts just telling me what they knew that I wanted to hear. Of course, as soon as we walked into the circus tent, I smelt a smell that I remember very distinctly from my childhood growing up next to the home butchery. I'm quite sure that I smelt the smell of animal fear, and that smell lingered long after the performance, which did indeed involve the unhappy antics of numerous animals, including lions, penguins and seals. I'm sure I smelt their fear, for instance. And you might say, well, perhaps it was animal excrement that I was smelling, and maybe it was. But I've been around animals a long time in my life, and this smell definitely brought back the scent of my childhood. So smell and touch, if not taste, are more important to an experience than we think, and to all of us. A second point to make about the senses that we bring to a production is that valuing sight and sound over smell and touch makes theatre less accessible to those audiences with visual or oral impairments. Theatre designers and directors have taken on this challenge very admirably of making theatre for audiences now who lack eyesight or hearing, and in doing so that they've discovered that thinking outside of this sight-sound box makes good theatre for all audiences. Because what is theatre if it's not the opportunity to experience the lives of others? So I'm just going to show you a video which is an example of this from an Australian company, and just to explain, because there's quite a lot of narration in this video. So this is a company that put on a production by two performers who were both blind and deaf. So if we could play the video, please.
We are both deaf-blind. Our journeys are very different. Heather, she was born deaf. She used to see. I was born blind, and I used to hear.
Michelle is a pianist and is deaf-blind. And Heather Lawson is a performer. And they came up to me and said, Jodie, we want to make a show that's going to tour the world. And I was like, oh my God.
So the only way she knows what's happening
is through touch.
Is by feeling the
Yes,
Auslan
correct.
with her own hands.
Yes.
The aim is to show people the pain and survival of being deafblind.
Turning Michelle's lived experience into an artistic performance, how do you do that?
What we do as artists, we break rules.
It's been 4 or 5 years of working out how we do this show.
The show's now a month away, so I don't know what to expect actually. They'll be given an insight into what it's like to be someone who can't hear or see.
Some people can find it at first a really frightening experience.
But it's actually okay. With support, you're fine.
Amazing.
It's really important to respect their story and to not skim over the incredible depth of who they are.
I had very bad mental health troubles. I felt lost. I felt alone.
We've been invited to perform at Sydney Festival.
All of Australia know about deafblind art, that it's possible. We show the world what they never thought would happen.
This is the beginning of our art, not the finish.
The award goes to Jodie Mundy.
So finally, though, none of the arguments around the merits or the limitations of the specific senses and as a means of communicating aesthetics accounts for the way that we might feel a performance in our gut, in the soles of our feet, and through the racing of our pulse and the working of our minds. My colleague Matthew Reason, who has long been fascinated with this bringing of our feelings into a performance, worked with another author, Sarah Reynolds, to ask audiences a really marvellous question as they exited the theatre. They asked, where in your body did you feel the performance? And they gave these options so you could click on which part of the body you felt the performance. And Matthew and Sarah collated their responses into an alien homunculus of the human body. So this is what it looks like when you kind of aggregate all of the data. So there's 2 performances, both by the Royal Theatre of Copenhagen. The one on the, I think you can see that, the one on the right is 5 soldiers and the one on the left is Cinderella. So you can see with 5 soldiers, that's mostly in the mind, a little bit in the heart, a lot in the stomachs and the hands, interestingly enough. Whereas for Cinderella, there was a lot in the heart, in the eyes, and less in the hands and stomach. And so here are some interesting accounts as to why people explained, when they explained why they chose that certain body part. Life and death is a sensitive subject, they would say. I felt it in many places in my body, but especially my heart. Or the story gave me a knot in my stomach. So we adjust our senses according to the kind of performance we see and how we invest in it. In immersive experiences, we may be arrested by olfactory sensations heightened by the wearing of blindfolds and masks. Or we might be in hushed silence to a string quartet, where it can be quiet and monosensory. Other experiences might require a kind of a forensic attention to detail or our full emotional investment. And the paradox that we'll finish with today is the knowledge paradox, in which the people whom we see as the experts in theatre, such as theatre directors and producers, both claim to know their audiences well, but also either to not know them or not want to think about them. Many theatre companies, at least the large ones, are often structured deliberately so that the creatives of the production have very little to do with the audience. Audience engagement is often the sole responsibility of the marketing department, and it's left to the end of the production process after a fully crafted theatre piece is made. But it's not just the large organisations that have this ambivalent relationship to their audiences. So last month, I ran a focus group in the town of Geelong in Australia, in this very beautiful building which used to be the courthouse, but is now an arts precinct. And one of the questions I asked was, does your show have an audience or a market? Seems quite an elementary question, really. But the following is a quote, a variation on a quote that we often hear when we talk to theatre makers about audiences. So this person said, there's definitely a community that the work is created with and for, but the audience is quite secondary and a byproduct. The audience isn't imagined when the work is being conceived or developed. A lot of interactions that make up the work will lead to an event, but they aren't planned for, they're incidental. It's very common to hear artists explain that they deliberately do not think about their audience when they're developing a work because they're worried that if they did, they would end up just pandering to audience tastes. And if they do seek an audience's impression of a production, they do so in very informal and post hoc ways, by milling around the bar after a show, for instance. But later, in that same focus group, I asked what the measures of success were at the end of a project. And the very same person said, even though I said before that the work we do doesn't need an audience or expect an audience, it would still be really lovely to have an audience come here and see the stuff we do. I mean, yeah, that would be huge. With the program we support, to know that there was a local audience for it, that would be a huge success for us as an organisation. So here's the paradox. We both want audiences, but we don't necessarily want to think about them. Finally, even when theatre companies do seek information directly from their audiences, it's often difficult to get useful information because people will struggle to articulate what they felt, what they saw. People are more likely to say, yes, it's good, I liked it, but they find it very difficult to articulate the experience beyond that. So what does our discussion of paradoxes tell us about audiences? We know that audiences are both ordinary and extraordinary. The appetite that most people have for being in an audience of some kind is shaped by a lifetime of doing so. We are an audience from birth. We also know that audiences want to be involved, hence the rise of participatory theatre. We like to be together, and being together is a common experience that helps us to feel connected. And while we might use our eyes and ears to experience a performance, we're also using our whole body. And finally, there are forces in place that mitigate against audiences, understanding audience as well. Gracias and gracias, and I look forward to a wonderful congress and getting to hear from you all as well.
Feu cara de voler un cafè, un té, alguna pasteta, però abans d'això deixarem 5 minuts per fer preguntes, aportacions que vulgueu fer, tant aquí com des del metavers, respecte de les aportacions que ens ha fet la Katya Johanson. Tenim a Rosa i Joana, que estan aglutinant totes les aportacions que s'estan fent des del metavers. Hi ha alguna pregunta que tingueu? Tenim personal amb micròfon a la sala. Rosa, tens alguna aportació?
There is some question in the room.
Miquel, posa't en peu, sisplau.
Catalan? English? In English?
Formula-la en català i traduirem a l'anglès, no pateixis.
Jo potser et volia preguntar si aquesta recerca que heu fet amb aquestes 5 paradoxes del públic, si us heu atrevit en algun moment a intentar definir què és el públic, o en altres paraules, què és el públic per tu?
Joana, micro. Joana.
¿En castellano? No, que ante estas 5 paradojas que nos han contado, la pregunta que hacía es si en su grupo de investigación se han atrevido a intentar hacer una definición del público, o si no, una pregunta muy heavy, que es ¿qué es el público para ti?
Miquel was asking if in your research investigation group, if you have some kind of actions and what it is for you, the audience and the spectators.
I mean, we do have actions. I think probably the main thing that we keep coming across is the need to better understand who audiences are and why they're motivated to be there, and also to understand better the people who we want to be in the audience who aren't there. Do you want to? I don't know how this works in terms of translation. Shall I pause? No. So. So, for instance, I mean, I think probably around the world, but in Australia particularly, there's a much sort of stronger sense emerging that we need to really kind of appreciate that the public is becoming more and more diverse, that public funding for the arts will not continue unless audiences become themselves much more diverse. And I don't know that theatre companies at the moment are very well equipped to understand the audiences that do not come from their own traditions. And so, I think probably, if I could boil down all of the advice that we had into one sentence, it would be to, come together around better understanding the populations that are new to theatre, perhaps not even yet in the theatre, and what they're looking for from that experience and how we might deliver that.
Tenim temps per una última pregunta, abans de fer el coffee break. Joana, tenies alguna cosa del metavers?
There's any question in the room for the English?
Sí, aquí ya tenemos una pregunta, ¿sí? Si te quieres presentar.
Hola, sí, soy Cristina Álvarez, trabajo en la Fundación Orquesta y Coro de la Comunidad de Madrid y quería ahondar un poco en la reflexión que ha hecho sobre el tratamiento de los públicos desde el Departamento de Marketing. El hecho de que los artistas a veces planteen pues esa no importancia, ¿no?, de lo que opina el público de sus trabajos. No sé si en qué momento deriva hacia más una transacción económica de vender entradas o quizá tendría que pensar más en lo que es la comunicación con el otro, sobre todo en el teatro, ¿no? Porque al fin y al cabo pues, existe una intención de comunicación en toda obra de arte de alguna manera, ¿no? Entonces quizá por ahí sí que me gustaría que nos hicieras una reflexión sobre estas dos ambivalencias que siempre juegan entre artista y público, ¿no? La transacción económica y la comunicación con el público, también como ejercicio más democrático, ¿no?
At what extent do artists have to work thinking about communication and relationship with the audiences beyond their role as artists,
In my experience, the artists who are very much in touch with the communities that they're working with are the more successful, in the sense that their work does naturally have an audience and that so much of what they do depends on those relationships with their communities. I think perhaps, in a sense, what we've seen historically is kind of a real decline from the sort of grandeur of the way that theatre production has happened in the past to a much more kind of local and intimate settings, which began, of course, with community arts and then moved into things like participatory arts, So I think, social practice, that sort of thing. But I do think that that's, in a sense, the most successful model in terms of how artists work with audiences.
Perfect, thank you. Un aplaudiment per la Katya. Fem una pausa de 25 minuts aproximadament i a les 11:30 tornem a la platea. Gràcies.